I was in a charity shop sometime last year when I spotted this Pentax P30T along with a load of other cameras. I quite liked how it looked, and I was also interested to see how good, or bad, the attached Vivitar 28-200mm lens was. It was a bit of a gamble because there were no batteries in the camera, and the P30 shutter won't fire without batteries. The mirror was stuck up, and I didn't feel that I could pull the lens off to check it at the time, so I bought it more or less unchecked. When I got it home and checked it properly, the lens was so opaque that you could barely see through it, and having released the stuck mirror, I was greeted by the infamous Pentax infinite wind. I'd already got a Pentax ME Super sitting in the repair queue suffering from the same issue. There is a fairly non-invasive fix that you can do on these cameras working from the underside. You should find plenty of videos on YouTube showing the procedure. It's a perfectly valid technique, but it won't always fix the problem, and ultimately a full strip down will be a better solution. I had tried the quick fix method on the ME Super. It worked for about a day before it started sticking again, so that camera was left in the to-do pile. I tried the same technique on the P30 and this time it worked properly. So a few days later I popped a roll of Wolfen NC500 film in the camera and headed out to get some shots. If you've seen my first video looking at NC500, you'd be forgiven for thinking that I hated the stock. But after figuring out that when rating it at 200 ISO or even slower, the film really comes to life. Shooting it at its box speed of 400 ISO just seems to create disappointment. I'd already noticed that the exposure meter on my P30 was overexposing by a bit more than one stop, and there's no way of manually setting the film speed as it uses the DX code on the film canister to set the ISO. So putting the roll of NC500 in with its 400 ISO DX code would effectively rate it just under 200 ISO, which is exactly what I wanted. I checked the resulting exposures against a handheld meter before heading out to get some shots. At some point during the day I suddenly became aware that the exposures were way lower than I expected, and checking against a handheld meter it was exposing at something like 50 ISO. My theory is that one or more of the DX code reading pins had lost contact with the film canister, and if the camera doesn't detect a code it defaults to 100 ISO, and as it overexposes by a stop or so, that would give me the 50 ISO I was seeing. However, that just gave me more information on the Wolfen NC500 film, because when rated at the box speed of 400 ISO it looks horrible, like this. And when rated at 200 ISO it looks rather fantastic, like this. And when rated at 50 ISO it still just about holds up. It's definitely a better look than when it's set at the box speed, and don't forget that 50 ISO is a whole 3 stops over box speed. Once I'd spotted the issue, I shot the rest of the film using a handheld meter, resulting in shots like these. After I'd finished the film I put the camera away for a month or so, and the next time I tried it we were back to the infinite wind. If I try enough times it will eventually manage to cock the shutter. I shot this bit of footage a couple of weeks ago and it took something like 46 attempts before it would actually fire. Not so good if I'd loaded actual film into the camera. Having successfully cocked once, it generally works okay, but I wouldn't risk it with film until I've sorted the problem. In the meantime I stripped the ME Super apart earlier this year, replacing the perished bump stops and loads of crumbling foam that you'd never get to sort out if you didn't do a full strip down. It's now working perfectly. It currently has a roll of film in it, and what a lovely little camera it is to use too. Anyway, I figured it was about time to tackle the P30, and against my better judgment I thought I'd show some of that process in a video. I'll do a voiceover separately because if I try to talk while I work it'll just come out as a load of garbage. Plus the video will probably be about 6 hours long and no one wants to watch that. In the interest of keeping the video vaguely punchy, I won't include every detail, but I'll try to cover some of the major bits. This isn't going to be a how-to video. If you want to try it yourself, take photographs at every step and make copious notes, because I won't be able to help you if you can't remember how it goes back together once you have a pile of random bits on your workbench. I'm hoping that the architecture of the P30 will be pretty similar to the ME Super, and I'll be able to refer to my notes from that camera repair. So first things first, I'll take the top off. I've already done a dry run off camera, but I'll point out the potential tricky bits as I go. The plastic cover on the film advancing lever is held in place with a single screw on the underside, the pivot end being retained by hooking over the metal section beneath. There's a screw securing the metal section of the advancing lever, and like the ME Super, this is a left-hand thread, which can be a bit of an issue if you're unaware of that fact. The screw on this was either ridiculously tight or it had been fitted with some kind of thread lock, but eventually I got it moving. Next is the film rewind crank. Unlike many cameras where you jam a screwdriver or similar into the forks of the drive shaft and rotate the rewind crank backwards, the P30 has a single screw securing the crank to the shaft beneath. It's a little tricky because the crank is keyed into the shaft, and as you undo the screw the crank loses its connection with the shaft and the shaft just starts spinning, so you have to open the film door and keep hold of the fork end so the rewind shaft won't turn. There's a single screw located in the recess beneath the rewind crank and a threaded lock ring round the film advancing shaft. Then there's two shouldered screws on the front of the prism housing and two shorter shouldered screws beside the viewfinder eyepiece. The left-hand one of this pair was again ridiculously tight, and it was all I could do to get it out. The top cover is now free to come off, but be aware of the two wires going to the hot shoe. These will need to be unsoldered before you can put the top cover to one side. Now that's out of the way, I need to figure out which wires I need to disconnect in order to remove the mirror box. The P30 is different enough to the ME Super to make my previous notes irrelevant, so I'll go away and think about it for a moment, and when I return I'll have probably marked several of the wires to ease the reassembly process. Well, that's most of the wires marked up, reference photos taken and diagrams drawn. Some of them might not need to come off, but it's such a rat's nest under there that I'll just remove them all, more or less. The shutter speed and shutter button PCB will need to come off, as will the on-off switch PCB on the left-hand side. Or I could potentially unsolder that PCB from the main board once I got the wires off. As with anything where I'm working on sensitive electronics, I've got myself earthed with an anti-static wristband to reduce the risk of zapping a chip from a static discharge. So I'll get unsoldering and then figure out what's next after that. Getting the wires disconnected is simple enough, but trying to reroute them correctly when I reassemble the camera is going to be a right pain. OK, that lot is unsoldered, and the on-off switch and shutter speed boards are now loose. There's two screws securing the viewfinder. The left-hand one secures the electrical connection that had one of the wires from the top cover attached to it, and then the viewfinder should just lift off. Interestingly, it looks like some glue from assembly has got onto one of the light cells that sit next to the viewfinder, which might explain why the meter tends to overexpose on this camera. I've popped the top back on loosely so I can invert the camera without it sitting on the PCB. There are 4 screws to remove the bottom cover. The one next to the hinge end of the battery hatch is longer than the others. When I first took the bottom cover off to do the keyhole surgery repair, it was fairly well stuck to some light seal foam where it joins the nose assembly here, and it took a fair bit of gentle teasing to get it off. Once inside, the rewind button falls out, so that needs to be put to one side. When I worked on the ME Super, I had to disconnect some wires, but looking at my notes, it was the ones that went to the motor drive contacts, and the P30 doesn't have those, so maybe I can leave everything as it is under here. I'll find out soon enough anyway. Next thing to come off is the leatherette, or in this case the rubberized front covering, which, as was often the case by this time, looks like it's stuck in place with double-sided tape rather than a traditional glue. I used strips of double-sided tape placed side by side when reinstalling this stuff. There was a little plastic blanking plug stuck over a hole in the left-hand side of the camera, and the entire grip section on the right-hand side comes off as part of the rubber trim, leaving a more or less conventional shaped camera beneath. OK, I've skipped ahead a little bit now. I've removed the 2 screws that sit to the sides of the viewfinder, here and here, and the 4 screws that held the front plate in position. On some cameras there will be shims between the front plate and the body of the camera to fine-tune the distance between the lens mount and the film plane, but there are no signs of any on this camera so far. I've also removed the metal plate that sat beneath the shutter speed PCB. This leaves the front section of the camera more or less loose, but I still need to tease out some of the wires that cross in front of the prism. I should have done this first, but in the excitement of filming the video I forgot. Right, that's the wires that were preventing the mirror box from coming out, all teased out of the way, and most importantly their original positions recorded in my notes, so I can reinstall them later. Now the front plate and mirror box should lift out of the body. Thusly, it's worth taking more photos at this stage in case any wires pull off while working on the camera, otherwise I won't have a clue where they came from. Also, much of the light seal foam will be perished and in need of replacement, so I'll make a note of those locations too. The foam on my ME Super was in a far worse state than the P30, but this could definitely do with renewing. With all that apart, we can finally take a look at the common failure point on these Pentax cameras, which is a little rubber bump stop behind this lever here. Usually you'll find that this lever is slow or not moving at all because the rubber has perished, and if that lever doesn't return as it should, you end up with the infinite wind issue, and also sometimes the mirror sticking in the up position. In the case of the ME Super, there's another bump stop that perishes but doesn't seem to cause a failure of the camera. That one is located somewhere around here, but it isn't present on the P30. The other failure on my ME Super was another rubber bump stop, which is located on the end of a piston that fits inside a brass cylinder on the underside of the mirror box assembly. This will be an air damper of some sort. I replaced the perished rubber bump stop with a new one cut from one of the sheets of rubber that I keep in stock at all times. But the P30T doesn't have that air damper, there's just a solenoid sitting in that location, so I won't have to do anything there either. So back to the bump stop that's causing the trouble. As the rubber decomposes, it deposits a sticky mess onto the pivot for that lever, causing it to slow down or stop altogether. If I prod the bump stop with a screwdriver, you should see that it just deforms and doesn't spring back into shape. I can remove the offending lever if I slacken the screw on the sliding section slightly, and then remove the pivot screw, which should allow me to ease the lever out of the way. Now I can remove the remains of the bump stop, initially with a screwdriver, and then I'll use IPA on a cotton bud to clean the post, the lever and the screw securing it, before turning my attention to making a replacement bump stop. Obviously the cleanup took far longer than you've just seen in the video, but it hardly makes thrilling viewing. It might be that the bump stop is only there to stop the mirror activating lever beneath from clattering when the mirror returns, but it had a bump stop before, so I've cut a replacement from a sheet of rubber. It's about 1.5mm thick, with an outside diameter of around 3.6mm, and an inside diameter small enough to grip the post when it's fitted. Before refitting the lever, I'll put a tiny drop of oil on the post, just enough to lubricate it, but not to soak into the new bump stop. The lever still needs to be re-engaged with another lever below. It's a bit fiddly, particularly working round the camera and tripod. This is about my 10th attempt. All were successful, but I failed to get a good video clip on every occasion. So I'll just fast forward through me fumbling to the point that I get the two levers engaged and the lever back on the post. Then the screw can go back in, along with tightening up the shouldered screw on the sliding section. The pin on the lever I've just reassembled needs to be below this spring-loaded lever, so when I move the sliding section, the pin in turn moves the spring-loaded lever. Now the mirror is back in place, I can test the mirror assembly by cocking the spring, then releasing the mirror so it goes up, and then moving the sliding section, which releases the mirror to return to its rest position. And I'll just give that one more go. So cock the spring, release the mirror, and return the mirror. And that all seems to be working nicely. So I'll go through the camera, replacing some of the perished foam and maybe a bit of cleaning and lubricating along the way, and then it'll be time to join the two halves of the camera back together. Before reassembly, it's easiest to remove part of the winding assembly on the bottom of the camera. There's a pair of plain screws, then a shorter shouldered screw, and a flanged screw on the winding cam. Then the entire section comes out easily. This is because the sliding section of the mirror lever needs to sit below the cam of the second shutter blade, being held down by that cam. So before the last part of putting the two halves back together, I'll need to reach through the bottom of the camera and press up on the other end of the mirror lever, which in turn lowers the sliding section. It might simply be okay to cock the shutter manually before assembly, but I'll do it the way I've described this time round. So offer the bottom end in first, making sure it sits on the new light seal foam that I've fitted in the bottom corner rather than pushing it out of the way. Then loosely pivot the top into place. It can rest like that for a minute while I tease the wires out of the way. I'd rather not get one of them trapped and have to strip the camera down again. At this stage the front won't sit flush because the sliding section of the mirror lever is hitting the front of the second shutter cam. So locate the bottom of said lever and gently press up until the sliding section falls below the cam and the front of the camera pops into place. However, right now with the camera in the way I simply can't see what I'm doing, so you might just have to take my word for it. Okay, that was somewhat easier once I could see what I was doing, and this time the front plate is sitting correctly. There's a little bit of springiness from the light seal foam, but I can now insert the 4 screws loosely in the front plate, and the 2 on either side of the viewfinder. And once I'm happy everything is correct, they can be tightened up fully. Most of the reassembly is a reversal of the disassembly process. I'll leave refitting the rubber trim until I'm sure the camera is back working. Refitting the winding levers in the bottom is a little fiddly. These 2 levers have to sit either side of the mirror cocking pin, and the silver coloured one has to be opened against its spring so the tab on the bottom sits on the back edge of the double wind protection lever here. So I'll get cracking with that and rejoin you in a bit once I've got something to show. Having made a note of where each wire should go, rerouting them wasn't a problem at all. Then it's simply a case of resoldering them all before testing the camera again. I won't tuck the wires away neatly until I'm sure everything is working as it should be. So now for the all-important test after all that work. Does the camera still function? Turn on. Advance the film, not that there's any film in the camera, and press the shutter button. And that all seems good. I'll check the full functionality off camera and reassemble the last few components before a quick summary. Well, that's the camera back together. Everything is working as it should be. The shutter speeds are good, as they were before I started the repair. I couldn't get the glue off the lens for one of the light meter cells, but I was able to generally clean both lenses and the back of the prism, which will let a little more light through. The meter now reads about the correct value, or maybe half a stop overexposed in some situations, which is no bad thing, so I can live with that. I cleaned all the DX code pins thoroughly, and swapping film speed changes the meter readings accordingly. I'll just have to see how that goes in the field. Looking at a fresh roll of NC500, the DX code is in the form of a crappy little sticker, so it could be that it wasn't giving a good connection, causing the camera to revert to 100 ISO. So I'll either use rolls with the genuine DX code and metal canister, or make a better sticker-derived code for future films that I put through this camera. Unsurprisingly, the film advance and the shutter cocking are working perfectly, so that's the camera ready for another film. The P30T is a basic little camera, but I rather like it. Underneath the plastic trim is a fully metal chassis and a lot of technology taken from earlier and more popular models. Oh, and the 28-200mm lens that came with the camera. When I took it apart, some of the rear elements are plastic rather than glass, and one of those had become completely opaque. Normal lens cleaning methods did nothing, and as it was, the lens was completely useless. So I carefully polished the affected element until it became transparent again. Not something I'd recommend, but occasionally it is the only solution. I'm not sure whether I'll use the lens with film, but here are some test shots taken on a Pentax DSLR, and it doesn't perform too badly. I'm sure it would have been better when it was new, but at least it's not scrap anymore. And that's about it. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.